Hey everyone, it's another episode of Reboot Ed Podcast, the show where we talk about big issues in education and hardly ever come up with any answers. Andrew Schwab, my normal co-host, is off being an IT director today and can't join us. But I got to tell you, I'm really excited. We've got Will Richardson with us, longtime blogger and speaker on issues in education, author, and sort of near and dear to my heart, a dad. And I read an article, Will, that you wrote on your blog piece about your kids going into high school, and that's kind of what triggered me to make a contact and try to get you on the show. Thank you very much for taking the time. I know you're traveling a lot, but thanks for being here.
No, thanks for having me, Mike. Really appreciate it.
So basically, you travel around and work with districts all over the place. What kind of work are you doing these days, and how's that fitting into your life?
Well, right now, actually, I'm up in Vancouver and working with a couple of districts tomorrow at Burnaby, doing some small group stuff with some leadership and some head teachers, and then I have a full day on Friday with 250 teachers over in Langley, which is going to be a really interesting day, but because that's a big crowd to have kind of only one facilitator. But just doing a lot of that type of stuff, a lot of speaking. And if you ask how it's fitting into my life, well, it's it's kind of an interesting balance that I'm trying to keep here between family life and yet going out and getting the opportunity to talk to some really interesting, passionate people and to engage them and hopefully start some conversations around some of the bigger questions that I think we're all going to have to deal with at one point or another if we're in education. And that's really what kind of excites me about this work is that it is, we're dealing with some pretty big stuff right now, and I just want to get those questions out there and hold some conversations with people and start some conversations around what that might look like.
I have to say, I had a meeting with, we have some teachers that are sort of working with me as an IT director in terms of integrating tech into the curriculum. And I told them at our last meeting, in some ways this is the most exciting time in my 30 years or so of being in education because of a number of things that are kind of coming together. One of them is technology that's becoming readily accessible enough for a lot of schools. One of them is conversations about curriculum and conversations about what works and what doesn't work at a point where it's starting to get some traction in a lot of different places. And you've written a number of blog posts, and you've now got a book that I want to talk to you about in a minute, but it really is an exciting time, and I think you're right. We've got an opportunity here that it would be a shame to see it get squashed by the status quo.
Well, it is exciting, but I think on some other levels it's really challenging too, because what's happening in terms of learning, and we're not just talking about kids here, we're talking about all of us. All
Right.
of us have access, and all of us that have some literacy around how to use that access to learn. Really what's happening in our lives kind of flies in the face of the traditional system of schooling. And, as you said, I'm a dad. I have 2 teenagers, and my kids are in high school right now. And one of the biggest frustrations I have is kind of listening to them talk about their learning in school as compared to their learning outside of school. They happen to be living at this moment when they have opportunities and they are empowered by access in ways that most people, up until even 10 years ago, never experienced in their own learning lives. And it's a very, very big shift that I still don't think that the vast majority of educators even sense the challenge that's coming at us because of it. When all of a sudden you have this mixture of passion and participation and real purpose, and that's from a book that I'm reading now by David Price called Open, but he talks about those 3 ingredients around learning, and then you couple that with access, and that access piece is the game changer, and that's the thing that we don't.
Right.
That's what we don't fully understand. That we've always wanted kids to pursue learning with passion and to participate and experience that stuff and to do it with a purpose. We've always wanted that. But now they can do it on their own in ways that the system just wasn't built for. And I think it's going to be extremely interesting to watch over the next 5, 10, 15 years to see how schools begin to either accommodate that or to try to push it away. I don't think they're going to be successful to push it away. So it's going to be a question of, do we fundamentally rethink this whole enterprise, and what we value about the time we spend with kids? Those are big, challenging questions.
Well, and along those lines, just up front, make a prediction, because there's a school of thought that says traditional education and the brick and mortar sort of schools that we all envision based on our past histories are essentially obsolete. And if we don't step back and take a look at how we can kind of organize this in the best interests of kids, kids are just going to walk away from it, and they're going to learn on their own in ways that may or may not be what we all agree on.
Well, and I think you see it too. I mean, if you believe the latest statistics, 52% of kids in the States who graduated from college last year are either unemployed or underemployed. 1 in 7 kids, or 1 in 7 people, I think it's 16 to 24, I was just reading this one too, 1 in 7 are either not working and not at school. I mean, either one, so they're basically not doing anything. And I think that a lot of that is due to this shift. One of the questions that I have about all those kids who are graduating without jobs is, well, where are the problem-solving skills to solve that problem? And pretty much they haven't gotten them, because that's not what school has prepared them for. School has prepared them for this very kind of traditional path through college, perhaps, for at least a third of the people in this country, but to a job, and that there's a job waiting for you there. If basically you just do the work, you kind of buckle down and that kind of thing. That's just not the case any longer, and it's going to continually, increasingly not be the case. That kids are going to have to come out and create their own jobs and problem solve their way through all that sort of stuff. But that's not what school's mission is. School's mission is to make sure kids are knowledgeable and have a certain level of content expertise in a very wide area of content. And that's built for a model, that's built for a time that just doesn't exist any longer. So, again, those challenges are big.
Talk a little bit about your own kids and going into high school and the sort of school, and it struck me because it's exactly what, my son is now 21. He's done with high school, but he's in that group that you're talking about. He does have a job, but it's a menial one. It's not the one that he dreams about, and he's not right now going to school. My daughter is in high school, and she's kind of on the other edge of that continuum. She's high-powered, top 4% of her graduating class, APs, going to college. Her path is more traditional than the one that my son did, but their experience in high school struck me to be very similar to what you talked about with yours.
Yeah, and I mean, this is my old school where I taught for 22 years, and I care deeply about many of the people that teach at that school, and some of my kids' teachers are my friends. So it's kind of painful to look at that place and kind of say, yeah, that's not really preparing my kids for the future that they're going to live in, and it's not. It's a very kind of top-down, traditional experience that they're getting there for the most part. I mean, there are some teachers there who are doing some inquiry, doing some problem-based types of learning in the classroom, which is great, but unfortunately it's not very consistent. And my son's a freshman, and he's 6 weeks in, and he's already saying, God, school's just boring me to death.
Yep.
It's just and I think if you ask my kids and you ask a lot of kids, why do you go to school? I don't think learning is the first answer that they'll give you.
Right.
It's more about my friends are there, or I want to play sports, or I want to be engaged in some of these other activities. But it's not about gutting out algebra, or taking 100-question multiple choice U.S. History 1 tests. So it's very frustrating, and like I said, it's on some level painful because I want more for my kids. One of our friends the other night, we were talking about this, and she just looked at us and she goes, "Well, then why don't you get them out of there if you don't?" And it's like, it's a really hard question. I mean, I love public schools. I want public schools to succeed. And, we're trying to co-school, that's what we call it. We're trying to provide opportunities for our kids to learn in those kind of passionate ways, those more authentic ways when we can. But I'm definitely a frustrated and kind of, I don't know. I'm not giving myself great grades as a parent right now when it comes to trying to figure this whole thing out for my own kids. So it's hard. It's just a really difficult moment.
Yeah, I totally concur. There's a couple different angles about that, and the first one is, yeah, we can all agree that that's it, and maybe or maybe not yanking your kids out of one school and sending them somewhere else is the solution on a personal level, but on a systematic level, it's really got to be a matter of reform. It's got to be a matter of change, and I think you and I would both agree that those changes are pretty substantial and radical. The old epistemology just doesn't get it anymore, and the new pedagogies that come out of a new way of looking at it are going to be completely different.
I just, I just think that we're operating under a context of what education should look like that is exceedingly out of date at this point. And the problem right now is that we're in this very interesting period of transition, this huge period of change, as a lot of people call it disruptive change, and it's come at us very quickly. I mean, when you think about it, the web, really, the social web, still is only about a dozen years old.
If that, right?
If that, right? I mean, I started blogging back in like 2001, and I had to explain to people what a blog was back then. So even if you count that, which was kind of the dark ages of it all, but I mean, it's a dozen years. That's it. It's still in its infancy, and the problem is that it's happened so quickly that there have been very few people, I think, who've had the time, number one, and kind of the energy and interest to really try to wrap their brains around what it all means. And I'll give myself like a B+ on that. I mean, I've spent a lot of time trying to look at, what the effect of all this stuff was in my own classrooms, and then certainly going out and trying to talk about, what does it mean in terms of reform. But there are so many questions I have that I don't have any idea what the answers are, and yet I'm probably, and you and I and the people who we're connected to on Twitter, we're probably in that 5% of people who are really even thinking about it at some level. And there's just this huge kind of I don't want to call it ignorance, but unknowing that's happened because of how fast it's gone. And there are just so many people that don't have this different context, especially when it comes to learning and education. And it's a real problem right now.
Well, and part of the issue with a disruptive sort of instance that you're referring to is that people react to that in a few different ways. Some people embrace it and get excited about the possibilities of the future, but I agree with you. I think it's a small percentage, and they all kind of cluster together. So we read each other's stuff on Twitter and kind of connect in various ways, but there's a huge group of people that sort of see that as something to kind of repel and hold off and kind of maintain the historical status quo. It's what they know. It's what they're comfortable with.
And I think that, those of us who are in these networks, I think many of us think that those networks are bigger than they are. I think the conversations that we're engaged in are a very, very small percentage of the conversations around schools and reform and all that stuff. And the other piece of it is, too, the difficult piece is, I'm thinking a lot about parents and how to get parents engaged in the conversation. And the more I talk to parents, the more I realize that we're all basically, I don't want to, well, I don't know if victims is the right word, but we're all kind of so steeped in our own narratives around education, around what we experienced. And if it was good enough for us, it's good enough for our kids. And we were bored too. It's part of going to school. You go to
Yep.
school, you got to be bored, and you just got to muscle through it, So when I try to say to parents, hey, all that content knowledge stuff and all those tests that your kids are taking, that stuff doesn't mean anything anymore. Can your kid do something with it? What kind of passions are there? When you start asking those types of questions, that's a totally different frame around which to try to define what an education should be, to define what should be happening in schools. And it's just a very difficult shift to make. And most parents are like, well, I hear that, but you know what? My kid's on a path. Don't experiment with my kid, right? I understand what the framework is. I understand what the rules are. I understand what the benchmarks are. Let's not mess that up. Let's not mix that up too much, because then you're putting my child's future at risk. And to say to them, no, by keeping them on the traditional path, you're putting your child's future at risk. That's a very difficult thing for them to hear. But I really believe that in many cases. I really do think that this traditional path, this traditional way we think about schooling, and I think the statistics are beginning to bear it out. That's what's putting kids at risk right now, because they're coming out of that experience without the mindsets, the dispositions, the skills to really learn powerfully on their own, self-organize their own learning, self-organize their own work, and problem solve their way through life, which is what they're going to have to do.
And how to learn how to work in teams that are relatively unfamiliar, at least at the beginning, and collaborate in those environments.
Yeah. And there's a whole literacy issue too. Those very traditional literacies, they're not going to support my kids. My kids are going to have all sorts of other types of real understandings around the world and skills to take advantage of all the technologies and opportunities and connections and networks and whatever else.
So yeah, I mean, and I'm thinking about your comment about the circle of folks that are having these conversations being fairly small, and I agree with you. So we could talk back and forth, with those issues in terms of creating a nice little cult of personality or something. But you travel around to different schools, and schools contact you. You go in and you start working with them. What's the reaction for the schools that you're working with when you bring these ideas in?
Well, it's mixed. I mean, I generally get pretty good feedback on the presentations that I give, and the types of work that we do in the small period of time that we have to do it. I mean, a day is not nearly enough, but for some people, they get angry, they get scared, they grieve in a lot of ways, because basically the message is this picture that you've held in your head about what teaching is, this picture of what a classroom should look like, is really not the picture of what modern learning should be. And
it's obsolete.
And what modern teaching should be. So for some people, they get excited by that, and they're very pumped up by that, and they kind of run toward it. But I think for a lot of people, it's a bit of a shock, and it depends on the school. I've been to some schools that have been really steeped in tradition, where it's a very difficult message for people to hear. I've been in other schools where you've got a culture that really supports innovation and really allows teachers to poke the box and to try different things. And so in those places, people are just chomping at the bit. Where do we start? What can we do? But I think in general, I think for most people right now, I'm guessing the reaction they have for me is pretty much they shake their heads and they hear it, and I think on some level they get it, but they still got to go back and get their kids ready for the test, and they still have to go back and be ready to be evaluated by the state 50% on what those test scores are. You know what I mean? The barriers are huge, and the cultures are very difficult. So yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's just a very difficult shift for people to make.
you have a little book that you just came out with that I thought was really interesting, and it's sort of like everybody kind of knows the answer to the question, but we all dance around it. And the book is your little TED book called Why School? And I think the basic premise of it is brick and mortar schools are just not going to cut it anymore if they want to be the same thing they've always been. They need to be a little more open-ended. They need to be a little more student-centered. And that kind of goes along with what you said about kids just being bored out of their minds. I'm wondering your thoughts in terms of kids have more and more access to information that used to be sort of sole sourced from the teacher in their little silos of different subject matters, thinking about the high school model. What do you think is going to happen in terms of those sorts of schools that are going to try to hold on to that kind of model?
Well, I mean, I like to say that if we're going to compete on the stuff that you can put in a 15-minute Khan Academy video, I mean, we're toast. I really believe that. I think our new value now is the stuff you can't put in a video. It's the support and the development of dispositions. It's really about learning, not simply about mastering a discrete set of content or certain formulas or whatever else. And it's learning about learning. It's that metacognitive piece that is that I really believe, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's what we're doing right now, needs that kind of synchronous human interaction in some way. And I still believe that since schools are a big part of our communities, that they should continue to play a really big role in our community. But again, what happens in those schools has to be different. And right now we're so focused on, all right, let's get better. Let's make the test scores go up a few points this year. Let's make SAT scores go up. Whatever else. It's just all about getting better. Whereas I think it has to be different now. Khan and about 10,000 other sites like it have pretty much taken on that role of content. And so, if we're going to continue to say that we're going to, force kids to go through all of the curriculum that they currently go through, they're going to learn it at the pace that we set for them, that they're going to, that we're going to assess them, and all that kind of stuff, that we're going to manage that whole process. I just think at some point, especially older kids, are just going to stand up and say, you know what, this is no, we're done with this. I can do that stuff anytime I want. Let's get to the real work of learning, which is making stuff and collaborating with people and solving really big problems and making all that stuff in the context of living in the world, real problems for real audiences. That's going to be the value of school if it sticks around.
The thing you talked about too was the sorts of skills that schools need to be talking about is the metacognitive stuff that you mentioned, but it's things like how to work together and collaborate, and not necessarily in a small group of four desks that are put together in a classroom, but even remotely. How do you go out and find people that are working on the same problem that you are and make sense of that? How do you think critically about what's going on? I
mean, to be honest, I think that's one of the greatest affordances of the web, is that we don't have to make contrived problems for the classroom any longer. We don't have to, you know what I'm saying? I mean,
right.
We can let kids pursue the things they care about, because there are people around the world absolutely who care about those same things and want to solve those problems as well. So if we open up our minds to it a little bit, what we can see is this really kind of global interaction that meets kids in places, meets their passions. And you and I and everybody knows that you don't learn anything if you don't care about it, right? So, and you can't make someone care about something. You can't make my son care about algebra. Sorry. My son loves basketball, so if you want to help him or show him ways to learn math in the context of basketball, that you got a better chance of doing that. But the larger point is that, if we want kids to really learn, they're going to have to learn around the things they really care about. And now the web gives us the opportunity to let those kids connect to other people who care as deeply, if not more deeply, around those questions. And that's a really cool thing. But it's a big shift. It's a much different way of thinking about roles of teachers, roles of classrooms, roles of schools, all that type of stuff as well.
And how do you see that? I mean, there's two ways to go. I talked with Linda Darling-Hammond a number of years ago about the idea of just educational reform and how do you walk into an existing school and facilitate that change in culture. And there's two thoughts. One thought is that you start small, you get groups and build a sort of critical mass and then work through the existing infrastructure. And Dr. Hammond's position was that doesn't work very well. It's best done with D10 caterpillars and you just blow the whole thing up and move off.
I would
that
agree.
leaves a whole lot of people out in the lurch.
I can tell you, I've wanted to write another book for the last 3-4 years called From Old School to Bold School. And, I've done some presentations around bold schools, these schools that are trying to take this history, 50, 100-year history of traditional education and move to this kind of bold vision that's steeped in student-centered learning, inquiry, authentic, digital, connected, all those things. I haven't written the book because I can't find too many that have fully made that transition. A lot of schools start on that path, and then all of a sudden leadership goes away. New leaders come in. They don't buy into that same vision, so they kind of retreat back, or communities don't support it. There have been a number of places that I think, especially, I'll give a shout out to like the New Tech kind of network of schools, which has done some really interesting work in at least moving toward a problem-based kind of culture. I'm not so sure that they're fully to the kind of learning environment that we're talking about, but still, it's a shift that's been made, and it's interesting the ways that they get communities to literally buy into that, because there's a cost involved in making that transition, and basically so they invest in communities into that change. But the 10 schools or so that I could point to that I would say are really doing the type of learning that we're talking about, almost all of them were built for that purpose in the last 10, 15 years by people who had real vision, people who were dynamic leaders, people who knew what they wanted in terms of teachers who were kind of learners first, and were willing to just do collaborative problem solving with kids, ask questions they didn't know the answers to, and were fine with that, and could kind of be comfortable in that type of learning environment. So it's a really difficult transition to make. I'll tell you one quick story though. There's a superintendent in Castleview, Colorado, who is next year going to take his incoming high school freshman class, 150 kids. And the last kind of iteration that I heard of this was basically he was going to take those 150 kids, put them with somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 teachers, keep those groups together all 4 years. No classes, no schedules, no bells, no like divided disciplines, any of that stuff. Just really big questions that kids generate, and give them the time and the support and the kind of culture around that to really pursue learning deeply in those areas. Now, he's got to flesh that out a little bit, but that is such an outlier,
Oh, yeah. That's what you would call a bold experiment right there.
That's right, exactly right. In a dozen years of kind of going around or 7, 8 years of going around and just talking to people and asking what's new, what's different, that's about as far out there as I've heard. But he's really serious about doing it.
Nice. It's sort of along the same lines. You wrote a blog post. I think it was earlier this month.
Did I write one this month? I haven't.
I'll have to check the date. But
yeah, no, it's been too much.
You've written some stuff, and you've been very vocal on Twitter, and I applaud it. With the $1 billion debacle that is LA Unified's rollout of iPads, which is really taking a device that provides access and slamming it over the top of a traditional system in hopes that something magic will happen. But then you contrasted that with the approach that a group in New York, is it Scarsdale?
Yep.
Talk a little bit. I think for this podcast, just talk a little bit about your impression of what happened in LA Unified. But I'm real curious to hear your thoughts about the approach that they're taking in Scarsdale.
Well, I think the problem with LA Unified is that they didn't change the vision of what teaching and learning looks like when every child has access. And I'm not a huge fan of iPads as opposed to laptops. I would much rather see kids have laptops, but that's for another day.
Right.
Either way, even if it's BYOD, if you're gonna create classrooms, or if you're gonna allow classrooms where every child has internet access, you better change your vision of what teaching and learning looks like. Because if you don't do that, and you do what LAUSD did, which is basically hand out iPads with digital worksheets and digital textbooks and lots of multiplication apps on it, and
some lame attempt to prevent kids from accessing things at their own will,
you're going to get exactly what you got, which is kids who look at it and go, like, why do I even want this thing? It doesn't change anything. It's still the same, basically, crappy curriculum that I've been getting on paper. So I'm going to hack the machine. I'm going to break it. I'm going to go in and I'm going to do stuff on it that I want to do, pursue the type of learning that I want to pursue. And so that's the point, right? The point is, if you're going to get every kid access to the internet, you can't then say to them, but we're only going to let you access this one little shelf of this vast sum of human knowledge, right? This vast library of stuff and people that we have access to now. Now you can't go to all that other stuff. We're only going to let you focus on the stuff that we want you to focus on. Right. If you give one-to-one to kids, you also have to give them freedom to learn. Because if you don't give them a freedom to learn around the things that they care about, you're going to get exactly what happened in LA. And you're going to waste a whole bunch of money, which is what Larry Cuban has been talking about for years, in terms of how much money we've spent that has changed nothing. It's not the technology's fault. It's our lack of vision around it. And again, I think that speaks to the people making those decisions have these deep-seated histories around what education should be. And the idea of giving kids freedom to learn with an internet-enabled device is foreign to them, not just from a technology sense, but just from a practice sense, from a theory sense, from a tradition sense. So the kind of juxtaposition of that is up in Scarsdale, where, and believe me, Scarsdale again is a district of privilege. I mean, it's probably their teachers are among, if not the highest paid teachers in the world. They have a huge tax base. It's a very, very high income area. So given that, they still have decided to try to change the way they think about how learning happens. And so they created an innovation center where basically they are now doing maker education types of things. They are doing collaborative inquiry between teachers and students. They are doing all sorts of these other types of initiatives in pilot ways that are trying to change that context. Trying to say, okay, the world is really different now. I mean, Scarsdale was one of the first schools to get rid of AP courses. They basically said, we're not going to play that game. And they decided to create their own courses at a higher level, that they thought were more meaningful for kids rather than doing this huge memorization thing, taking a test and then dumping all that information out of your brains because the test was over. They wanted to make it a real learning opportunity. So anyway, Scarsdale has been at the forefront of this type of innovation. But I just thought the really cool thing that Scarsdale did was a couple of weeks ago, and that was what the blog post was about, is they released this like 80-page PDF that basically said, this is how we did it. Here it is. Take it. This is why we did it. This is how we did it. This is what we think is going to happen because of it. Here's where we're going to go in the future. Take it. And they were transparent about it. They shared it out. And I think it's just a powerful statement of not only the kind of culture that they've developed there, the leadership that they have there, but their willingness to understand in this world that, all that good stuff, we shouldn't keep that to ourselves. We should celebrate that, and we should really get it out there for other people to use. So yeah, I mean, to me, that's innovation, and I'll just finish it, by saying this too. If you want to see the real contrast to that, there was another assistant superintendent who I met this summer in a Midwestern state who had just given iPads to every senior or every high school kid in the district, about 700 kids. And I said, so what's changed? And the first thing that he said was, well, now we can offer more AP courses to all our kids. And I just went, well, there you go. There it is right there. Nothing's changed. So it is about this vision piece of it. It is about this idea that, you can't give kids access to the internet, every single one of them, and then say to them, but you can only use it the way that we want you to use it. It's ridiculous, and it's not going to work, and it's just going to be a waste of money.
That just kind of blows me away. I mean, $400 a pop, and the best thing we can say is we've got more access to AP is more than a little disconcerting.
I agree.
And I'm also struck that the little iBook that Scarsdale put out is a fascinating read in a couple aspects. One is the fact that they even wanted to share it, because they're totally open about saying, hey, you could systematize this. You could take any existing environment and with a little bit of commitment make this happen.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also not seeing it as a competitive world. I mean, they really do have a vision that this might be a good idea that other people want to take a look at.
Well, and they have the luxury of that to some extent because they're Scarsdale. Because of where they live, because of the community in which they exist. So they do have some license for that. But still, I think that, I know Jerry. I was up there. I spent a day working with some of their teachers. That is the type of culture that they are creating up there, though, that says, look, take it. We want to share it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the powerful things about the web now, is that we can share it. We can create these things and just put them out there. So.
Yeah. I mean, just the counter to that, I've worked in affluent districts, and I'm currently in a district that's got a very high poverty rate amongst our families, and in some respects, it's more difficult to be innovative in a more affluent district because the parents have a vision that's really kind of steeped in the old way of doing things. You're going to take your AP courses, you're going to go to college,
right,
and you're going to sit down and, I hated chemistry, and damn it, you will too, but you're going to get an A, and then you're going to go to college, which really is sort of a do the dance for 4 years and worry about learning when you get out of high school sort of approach to things. In a lower SES district where test scores are always going to be, lower, specifically because of socioeconomics, it's almost like, hey, we can try stuff because the worst thing that can happen is nothing changes.
Right.
You can't really blow it.
Right.
Where people in a more affluent area kind of think there's a risk to do that stuff. So
That's a great
knowing that Scarsdale is a more affluent district, I think, is even more exciting. They're taking a risk in some respects, but it's almost like a no-brainer risk to me.
Yeah, and my own district, we live in a very affluent part of the world as well, and they basically are just changing up their schedule now to accommodate more AP courses and to also accommodate more preparation for the park tests. So again, you're right. I think that they are exceedingly motivated by what they perceive to be parent expectations, and probably correctly. That we want our kids to go to college. That's the path, and don't mess with anything that's going to potentially put that path at risk. Now, you got to give credit to those guys up in Scarsdale, though, when they come out and they convince parents it's okay. We're going to get rid of APs, but we're going to create our own experience for kids. It's going to be better for them, and colleges will be just as happy to see that work, if not more happy, than they will to see AP test scores. And as well as I do, I mean, there are a lot of schools now. Dartmouth was the first to pretty much say, we're not going to accept AP courses any longer anyway, just because they don't think I think it's because they didn't think they were as rigorous as they needed to be in the first place. But, that you can see where that conversation goes. You can see where that whole kind of thing ends especially now when, and I love that quote by Tony Wagner, and it was in the book too, but it doesn't really matter what you know as much any longer. It matters what you can do. It matters what you can do with what you know. This one other thing on that too, and I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm like on, I don't know what time zone I'm in.
No worries.
But I found it really interesting. I don't know if you read about what Bard College did last month, but
no.
So Leon Botstein, who's the president of Bard, I was actually up there last month. He's just this fascinating guy. There was this conference on democracy in schools, and he had this extremely provocative talk about the role of schools in a democracy. And if you can find it, you should definitely take a look at it. But anyway, Bard came out and they said the whole college admissions process is just stupid, basically. The whole idea that's based on grade point average and AP tests and SAT tests, which especially the SAT tests, can all kind of be scammed. I mean, the SAT, basically just look at the zip code where you live and basically you'll know what the SAT scores are. But anyway, so what they said was, okay, so what we're going to do is if you can write 4 2,500-word research papers, and we're going to give you the topics, and if you hand those in and they get a B+ by our faculty, you're admitted to Bard. That's it.
Really?
Yeah, that's it. And you kind of go, well, that's pretty cool, because it's like, again, it's what can you do with what you know? What can you do with your skills? Can you write something that's cogent, coherent, makes sense, makes an argument, whatever? Do you have those types of skills? And at the end of the day, if you can do that, it doesn't matter what your grade point average is. It doesn't matter if you have like a 2.0 or a 1.8. You know how many kids are in schools that are getting terrible grades, not because they're stupid, but because they're just bored or disenfranchised, whatever else. If they have the skills to do that, why shouldn't they go to college? So
tremendous number of kids just
So, but that's the whole. They don't want to play that game, and it's not that they're not smart. It's just they're not invested in that. So I just see more and more of that happening. I see more and more kinds of conversations in the higher ed sphere and also in other places, workforce and whatever else, where people are much less inclined now to care about those test scores and those numbers. And in this kind of transparent, abundant world in which we live, the emphasis now is becoming on, well, what have you done? I mean, show me something you can do. And that's a big shift as well in terms of how we prepare kids for the world they're going to live in.
Yeah, and that leads me to, you tweeted out, I don't know, the last few days, that some school that all the parents just basically got together and said, no, we're not going to do testing anymore.
Yeah, it was a New York City school. It was a small school, and it wasn't about a state test. It was more of a local test, but it was still significant because the state of New York has said that teacher evaluations have to be based on test scores, and that was going to be one of the scores that teachers were going to be evaluated on. But the whole opt-out thing, I mean, we did that, with my son the last 2 years when he was in 7th and 8th grades. We just held him home from the state test. I just think there's a growing sense of I don't know if it's frustration or anger or whatever else at how much the test counts, how many tests kids are taking, all that stuff. Sometimes the kind of genesis of that angst or that frustration, they come from different places. But I just do feel like there's this growing kind of parent voice that's starting to stand up and saying, yeah, this just isn't worth it. This isn't working. We're spending billions of dollars on this stuff, and it's not making my child any more passionate about school, any more prepared for the world that's coming at them.
Right.
So, hopefully we're getting to the point where maybe we'll advocate for sanity. Who knows? Well,
I think it's pretty clear. And what you're alluding to is part of that puzzle for me. Thomas Kuhn wrote about the structure of scientific revolutions, where there's a cusp, when there's a certain amount of impetus and readiness for a change to take place, and then the change happens really, really rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
Ted Sizer wrote about kids needing to demonstrate performance instead of turning in worksheet. This ain't new stuff.
No. But I do think that it's that access changes the conversation. I really do.
Yep.
Because of the transparency, because of the ability to create the technologies that we have now, allow us to make things and create things in ways that Ted Sizer probably could have never dreamed of, and I can't even imagine what it's going to be like, 5 years from now.
Yeah, but the transformative agent is that kids are no longer dependent on the teacher as a source of information.
That's right. And they don't need us the way that they needed us in the past. I'm just pulling out my power cord here because I'm about ready to run out of batteries.
Oh, okay. No worries. Well, I think we need to wrap it up anyway. But, we've had educators. I mentioned Sizer. Deborah Meyer was doing innovative work with schools on the East Coast 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
The progressive school movement's been around for a long, long time, no doubt.
Yeah. The Coalition of Essential Schools that Sizer started out of Brown University. We've had, you mentioned New Tech High. There are pieces of this from within education circles where they've stepped away and tried innovative things. But now what I see is that people who are not in the field of education are going into this and they're starting to point out some of these issues and what people are doing, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. Amanda Ripley wrote a book called The Smartest Kids in the World. She's a reporter, and she got interested in it. There was an article in Wired magazine about some school in Mexico and some work by folks in Pakistan, and I mean, these things are happening all over the world. It's getting to the point now where we can't really ignore it.
I'm going to plug it in and keep talking. Yeah.
Go for it. We can't really ignore it, but what I'm wondering is how do we get the conversation out of a small group of people, what you alluded to, that group that's smaller than we want to believe it is, and embrace the majority in a way that we can implement these changes in a meaningful way, quick enough not to lose a whole generation of kids.
Well, I'm coming. Here we go.
No worries.
Here we go. That's the whatever the number is now, $50 million question. And I use that kind of money analogy on purpose because there are people with lots more than $50 million out there right now who are trying to create a very kind of different path of what education reform should be. There are lots of people with lots of money who have lots of influence on policy, and you can see it happening. The whole race to the top thing, I mean, whether you agree with it or not, the way it was done, I think was just horrible because it was a big money grab at the end of the day. And when you do it that way, it's hard to separate out the motivations for people to change things. I mean, you want to change standards, that's one thing, but to get people to change standards because you're giving them, hundreds of thousands of dollars to do it, it kind of puts the whole process in doubt. So I think that's the other problem too, though, is that there are a lot of people outside of education who really aren't, who are really trying to change things, but I'm not sure that's best for education.
So you travel around a lot. And you talk to schools who are both on the verge of wanting to make these changes, and in some pockets, either a school as a whole or, groups within the school are very resistant to it. Is it doable, or are we doomed?
I think we're out of time, right, Mike? I mean,
we'll make this the last question, but it's kind of,
I don't know. I really don't know. The 150 years of history and these narratives that we built around schools are very, very difficult to shift. And I think in the near term, it's going to be if you think it's been disruptive up to this point, just wait. I think it's going to get extremely, extremely disruptive over the next, for K through 12 schools too. Higher ed, there's no question that the next 10, 20 years are just going to be insane. But I think K through 12 schools are going to be challenged as well. I think some of them will make it. You know, some of them will make the transition, depending on where they are, depending on the leadership, and depending on who they're listening to. But I think there are a lot of schools that are in quite a bit of trouble that are looking for the easier solution, and you know, we'll probably go down some paths that will try to make things better, but not really make things different. And at the end of the day, I take this idea from one of the best books I've read about any of this stuff is the Alan Collins, Richard Halverson book from about 3 years ago, Rethinking Education in an Era of Technology, where they say, you know, the kids who can opt out are going to, and the kids who can't are going to be the ones. This is one scenario. The kids who can't are going to be the ones who are left in schools.
Yeah,
that's a very sad kind of way of thinking about it, but I think it's a distinct possibility that a lot of that starts to happen.
Which has implications all over the place in terms of our social structure and that kind of stuff. But on that happy note, we are kind of out of time.
That's right. I got a bottle of scotch waiting for me right here. So
I think I need to go home and have a beer. But I really appreciate you, Will, coming on and sharing what your thinking is and that kind of stuff. How do people follow you? You're on Twitter and you've got a blog.
Yeah,
how do they keep in touch?
WillRich45, Will at WillRichardson.com. And let's just end it on a high note. And that is, you know, and I say this in my presentations too. I mean, look, it's an amazing time. You know, you said it at the beginning too. It's exciting, and it's an amazing time to be a learner. And I look at my kids, and I just go, the things you're gonna be able to do, and the ways you're gonna be able to learn, and the people that you're gonna be able to meet. You know, it's just really, really cool. I want that for every kid, and that's where the question comes in. You know, how many more grades of kids do we have to wait until that becomes the norm? You know, I think that's the tough question and the tough answer. But look, it's an amazing time, and we should all appreciate the opportunities that we have to learn right now. So that part of it is really good.
Definitely. Well, again, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
For folks listening or checking out the video later, if you're not following Will, you're missing out, because he's spot on in terms of what the thinking is about these issues. And again, Will, thanks.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.